So I still work with them. And so some of the materials that I'm using today are from Charlestown High School, and some of them are from the Internationals Network for Public Schools. I just want to give you a little bit of background on myself. In addition, is that I've taught history to all immigrant students in the past, mainly for low English immigrant students, so ELD 1s and 2s. And I've also taught history to high school students who are seniors, who are also immigrants and on their way to college. This year, I've also taught ESL 1, and so I've looked at the English standards in the Common Core and tried to figure out how to teach that to ESL 1 students. So really, my focus is a lot on low English speaking immigrant students. I would like to also talk a little bit about, right before we start, is that this traditional notion that immigrant students learn English first and then they learn content. And I'm going to try to debunk that, because I think that's a really easy way to think about how we kind of separate the different kinds of work, and instead to think about it more holistically and to think about how content really drives the language learning. And we know this. We know that people learn language because they're interested in what they're talking about. And so this session, it will be about giving students something to talk about. We'll be specifically looking at some projects, some project products, as well as some motivating activities or hooks to get students interested into the content, and then extracting language and language demands from that. That's just a general sense of where we're going today. I'm going to go ahead and go to my PowerPoint, and then read the objectives for today. Okay. We're going to brainstorm motivating activities to build background knowledge, match aspects of language definitions with examples and teaching strategies, analyze a product to determine the language demands and supports needed for different aspects of language, and review activities to focus on teaching content through an aspect of language. So specifically, when we're talking about content, again, we're going to delve into two different things: projects and motivating activities. And the reason for that is, in terms of especially projects and how that fits in, is that projects are a great low-stakes way for students to get practicing the language and to get really deep into a subject. For students who are often embarrassed in sort of thinking about what they are learning or what they are saying, it's a great way for them to practice and have multiple entry points. I'm just going to make sure that I don't think you can see my PowerPoint yet, so I'm going to go ahead and screen share with you. I think that should work. So can everyone see that now? I think that's okay. So those are sort of the objectives that we're going through today. We're going to move into first motivating activities, and some of you may know this as hooks, right? This is how you introduce the material and the content. So if you're having students do a project, then what is it that you're having students, how are you having students engage with that when they first are learning the core content, right? And so a lot of us have the tendency, or I have the tendency too, to do definitions first of vocabulary, and then you teach sort of the content through using the new vocabulary that you're teaching them. And instead, the way that I'm going to be presenting today is to flip that notion, to first present the core concepts through an experiential way of learning or through some sort of simulation or some sort of hook, and then have them be able to apply the language on top of that. So why motivating activities? It creates common experiences, it builds background knowledge and interest in a topic, introduces big ideas and core concepts. It's hands-on, accessible usually, and then later on we can always tack on the academic language to explain the things in which they've experienced already. So there are actually some documents that that are useful for you to look at that will be available to you through this site, but I have pulled out some of them to show you as examples. So examples of motivating activities include things like motivating activities, like simulations, sorry. Um, so for example, if you were teaching the French Revolution, to do a simulation where you give students different cards, they walk into the room and one is a queen and one is a peasant and one is a king, and you have them sort of reenact sort of like the French Revolution, at least the basics of it. And then from that simulation, you have some sense of, students have a sense of where they go from there in terms of language, right? They might be able to explain power relationships within that simulation, or they might be able to explain that there's some sort of hierarchy going on. And so you begin to be able to use academic language like monarchy or like hierarchy when in fact you've already introduced some big experience to them. So you could do it, I'm just giving some examples here, but for example, you could do, if you're teaching about Jim Crow, you could also do that, a simulation on that and understanding some of the segregation and laws around that. If you're a chemistry teacher, you could first conduct the chemical reaction so that students are interested, and then tack on academic language on top of that. You can do videos that are high graphics and low language. So you could do there's all sorts of different examples there, or pictures and artifacts and realia. For example, if you're teaching area, you could bring in a present that you need to wrap and ask students, without having to measure, without having to actually touch the materials, how would they begin to devise a plan to wrap a gift? You could have field trips and guest speakers. And so really these are things that are hooks to bring in students who might not be interested yet, or might not know they're interested, or might be sort of on the sidelines. And then this common experience allows students to have a common place where you can build on academic language and different vocabulary, different language structures to explain some of the things that happened to them. So once you've done some motivating activity, so I'm going to actually just show you really quick. This document is available to you through this website and this conference. And so it's developed by the International's Network for Public Schools. And it has several different examples of how to do motivating activities for you. So you can see lots of different examples and then go kind of delve deeply into more what those mean. And so there's like at least, there's like 16 different examples of motivating activities and some references. So feel free to look through that when you have a little bit more time. So, okay. So the other way that, so once you have a motivating activity, for example, you did a simulation on the French Revolution, you can begin to extract language from that content. Students will want to talk about that there was a king and a queen, and if they don't know that vocabulary, they'll start to ask what that means or how to say those things. And so you begin to not only start with the content, but having the content in front of you, you decide what are the language demands, what is going to be hard for them in terms of being able to express what happened to them. And so often when we think about language, we often just think about vocabulary and grammar, and there are a lot more other components to language. And so as an educator, you've probably heard about language development and language objectives, but really, how do you move beyond just that grammar and vocabulary and understand that there are lots of different ways of talking about language and to make that explicit for students? So this next slide is about, it's about looking at, that's what I just said. So these are the different aspects of language that can be looked at in terms of thinking about when you're doing language objectives or doing or designing a project, right? So once you have the project in mind, you kind of start with the project, and then you kind of look at what kind of language demands are. We're going to do a little bit of a review of these terms first, and then we're going to kind of jump into looking at some projects later on and trying to extract some of the language demands and the language aspects of those projects. So I'm just going to go through this list a little bit, and then I'm going to have Denzel do an audience poll just to see if all of us are awake and can do a little quick quiz on this. So phonology is about letters and sounds. That's mainly phonics, right? Like how do things sound when they're pronounced. Morphology is about looking at different parts of the word. So for the actual word morphology, you could say like morph actually means change, right? Or change to morph something. So looking at little parts of the word and having meaning from those parts. Semantics is about vocabulary, so it's word meanings. Syntax is word order and meaning in sentences. So where do you put sequence words? Where do you put transition words? Where do you put the subject and the verb and the object? That's all syntax. Discourse is looking at bigger chunks of text. Are you asking students to write a lab report? Are you asking them to write a cover letter? Are you asking them to write a literary analysis? Are you asking them to conduct an interview? So these are all different things that are much bigger in terms of when you're thinking about discourses beyond the word level, which is vocabulary, and beyond the sentence level, which is often syntax. It's much bigger. Pragmatics is about social language, being able to communicate effectively. So it actually is not only about the actual words that you use, but it's also about when you use certain language to certain people. For example, you wouldn't talk to a baby the same way that you talk to your professor. It's knowing when to switch. And also knowing sort of like the body language and the rules for talking. You don't stand, in America, we don't stand really, really close to each other when we speak, but in other countries that might be normal. And so pragmatics is really about how do you socially effectively communicate depending on what language function you want to convey. And metalinguistics is really about thinking about language and talking about language by using language. So for example, what I'm doing right now is talking about language in general. And so that's more meta, right? So if you're having students talk about the differences between code switching, like when you would use certain language for a baby versus a certain language for your friends versus a certain language for your professor, this is talking about language. It would be metalinguistics. So at this point, I'm going to ask Denzel if he can come on and do sort of an audience poll to help us review a little bit about these terms.
Katie, you can guide them through the questions.
Okay. Oops, sorry. Let me go back to that. I didn't realize you had it up.
I think perhaps because you're screen sharing, you may not be able to see.
Yep. Let me just go back. Yep. Okay. So the first one is B says buh. What is this an example of? And you can go ahead and click on it, and we'll do an audience poll and be able to see everyone's responses. Yeah, absolutely. So most people are saying that it's phonology. It's totally about phonics. Denzel, if you can load the next one. So talking about the differences in students' native language and English. So we're talking about there are cognates between Spanish and English. There's word sequences, things like sequences, words for sequence telling and things like that. Yeah, so it's mainly metalinguistics, and depending on what you're talking about, you could be talking about semantics or pragmatics, but really it's about using language to talk about language. So you're telling them similarities between cognates or similarities between things, between languages. The next one is adding ed can change a verb to the past tense. Yeah, most of you got this. This is morphology. So adding ed can change a verb, right? Or can change a word to make it mean something different. So this example is an example. So having students be able to say, I disagree with your idea. I think that. Yeah. So most people are clicking on pragmatics, which it is. So it's about how do you communicate with other people when you disagree with an idea. You don't say, no, you're stupid. You say, no, you're crazy. I have a different idea. You say, I'm sorry, I have a different idea. I disagree with you. I think that's how you would teach pragmatics. And then, is there any more, Denzel? Okay, so looking at the definition of democracy, or the difference between the word eight and the word eight. Yeah, absolutely. This is about semantics. It's about the differences between vocabulary and meaning, the meaning between different words.
That's all.
Okay, great. So great that we could review a little bit. The next thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to walk you through a project. And in this project, I'm going to show you let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint real quick. Let me toggle back to that. So we're going to use these aspects of language to be able to look at some projects, as well as the motivating activities to look at some projects and to be able to extract some of the language components of those projects. Okay, so it's really important to start with the end first, right? So what do you want students to actually produce? So the session before this was about digital storytelling. I'm not sure if the presenters, I'm not sure if they had talked about, had shown you examples. I'm guessing they did. But having a model or having like an end goal in mind, what would be proficient for you? What would show you that they've got it? What would show you that your students have got it? And then be able to not only design that and write out the product or act out the product or whatever product might look like, but then go back and look at it and say, okay, what are the content and language demands of that task? Okay. So I'm going to show you different projects. You're going to actually be able to go into small groups in a little while and focus on these projects and then look at the different aspects of language. And so we're going to look at one together and kind of go through the steps together. And then you're going to go through another project in your group and look at one, what could be motivating activities for students to get students hooked into this. And two, what would be some aspects of language that would be important to teach. So I'm just going to kind of go through this a little bit, and then we're going to focus on one of the ELA ones because there are two there. So you might, so again, projects are really great for English language learner students. Instead of just testing something and moving on, this is an opportunity for students to really delve deeply into something and be able to spiral lots of their knowledge, like lots of the things that you teach into into something that they will feel really proud of and really ownership of over time. So if we test students, often what happens is you test them and then they forget. Often that's actually what happened to me when I was a student. I'd learn all sorts of things from my short-term memory, and then I'd forget it right after the test. And so this is a great way for them to create their own thing, to practice it, and to delve much deeper into the content. Of course, this always takes more time, and of course, in like a Common Core world and standards world, you can't do this maybe for every single unit given your time crunch. But this is where you get students to really buy in and learn more deeply. So for example, I gave you a few examples here, which you'll be looking at. So you'll be able to choose. So the first ELA example is create and publish a video and written cooking recipe online. So
Katie, might be a good idea to screen share the example projects.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I had already done it. Sorry. Let me just see how to do that. Oops. Okay. Oops. Okay. Does that help? Yes. Okay. Okay, so the first project is to publish a video and written cooking recipe online, include an intro that compares this food with other cultures and your connection with the food, and then follow a classmate's recipe and comment on it online. So this can be, you can do one part of it, you can do all parts of it. I thought it would be really cool if you had the time to not only publish a video, but also have students follow the directions from another classmate, and then you can create sort of like a food day together or a festival together, and then you can comment on these things online. How was the recipe? How would you change it to make it better? Things like that. And so it's a really all-encompassing 4 different domains project of, you use your speaking to create your video. You would use your listening to listen to the video and cook. You would use written, because you would have to write out the recipe. And you would use reading, because you would probably read online some different recipes to help your recipe. So another example would be to create a YouTube video of good and bad job interviews. And so including tips for the interview process in your video. In history, you might ask them to write a letter from the perspective of someone. In this case, a mill girl working in Lowell, Massachusetts during the Industrial Revolution. In biology or science, there is a video that you can look at that's a narrative script and a video describing environmental change that leads to a change in population of moths. In math, you could give graphs and give things to students to have them evaluate velocity for 2 involved cars. So these are all different kinds of projects. I'm going to show you the first one here, the cooking recipe online. And then we're going to go through a process together right now of looking through some of the motivating activities that are possible, as well as looking at more closely at some of the language aspects of that project. Okay. So again, this is sorry, one sec. So these are the motivating activities that you could do with students. And I just wanted to let you know that there's also this reference sheet from the Internationalist Network for Public Schools about the aspects of language. So if you want to go back and sort of refresh your memory, that is also available to you as we're going into this. Okay, so before I was talking about starting with the end first and writing out exactly what you want students and what you want students to produce. This is actually something I found online through an online website for recipes. And it was exact format that I thought would be really great to teach for students. And so I'm going to kind of go through and think about one of the questions I had, which is sorry, I'm going to just show you real quick. Sorry. Okay. So we're going to model this one together, but these are the three focusing questions that we're going to be asking. One is, what are motivating activities that could create entry points for students to this topic? And two, what aspects of language does this product demand of the student? In terms of language, what will be difficult for students to produce this? And then three, what language activities, teaching strategies, and scaffolds can be used to practice different aspects of language as product demands? This last question about teaching strategies and scaffolds, I'm actually going to come back after the small groups and show you several examples of different ways to teach different aspects of language. And so we're not going to answer this right now for our model, but in your groups, if you have time, you can get to this third question if you want. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go back to this project that I'm having students create. So in terms of motivating activities, so the first question is about possible motivating activities for this project. I was thinking some things that we could have students do is actually you just bring in a scallion pancake. You bring in a green onion pancake and you ask them to eat it. And you could have them break off into groups and try to figure out, well, what would you do to make this? And hopefully some of the academic language or some of the language that will come out of that, or the need for language that will come out of that, will be things like ingredients, or things like materials, or things like, well, first you have to do this and then you have to do this, don't you? And so those are sequence words. And so again, using the motivating activity as an anchor to bring the academic language out, or to bring the language out for students. You also could show a cooking show. I was thinking that would be really fun to show someone actually making something or making scallion pancakes, and have them kind of get into the whole genre of cooking shows and things like that. And then, or you could also show them lots of different pictures. So like this, depending on the culture that your students are coming from, they might be able to right away recognize it, or they might be able to compare it with some foods from their own cultures. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with discourse, because I think that this is a great project to teach discourse. When we think about a recipe, what do we think? There's definitely different parts to a big recipe if you found one online, right? You'd probably have some pictures. You'd probably have a title. You'd probably have ingredients. You'd probably have materials that you need, and you'd have some procedure of what to do, okay? So if we're looking at this in terms of that, you can see that it's kind of divided in that way. What you need, ingredients, equipment, instructions, okay? And then you can see that also this kind of discourse, writing a recipe, is often in numbered or bulleted form, right? So we're not writing a full page paper, like a 5-paragraph paper. We're not doing a lab report. It actually very similar to a lab report, but it is sort of numbered here. And that's sort of what this discourse, which is a recipe, calls for, like numbered things. So I think, you could definitely talk about, in terms of discourse, the different sections, right? There are instructions, there's equipment, there's ingredients, and talk about what are the components of those different sections. In addition to, if you're using the medium of a online web sharing recipe site, you could also talk about, how people comment, or what this means when people comment online, and how you could do it, and you could integrate that into your project as well. In terms of looking at semantics, right? So many of these things, this lends itself to lots of different cooking semantics. So not only do you use the word cook, but you use the word bake, and how you handle the dough, right? So it's like you chop it, you roll it, you make it, you let it rest. These are all command words that, depending on depending on the word, it could have a slightly different meaning, right? To fry something versus to steam something mean two different things, but they all are encompassed under cook. So semantics would be a great way to teach semantics in terms of cooking language. In terms of syntax, you can see that there are a lot of words in here that could be used in terms of sequence words, right? You have words like then, you have words like for repeat this process, right? You could say when the oil shimmers. This is a time-based word, time-based phrase. So when you're looking specifically at syntax, you could actually teach different parts of sequence words to use within a recipe. In terms of pragmatics, it's interesting to look at the recipe because it's all in command forms, right? All the verbs are in command words. So make, roll, chop, top, roll, cut, coil, mix, cut. These are all words that are command words. And so, it would be very interesting to sort of draw that out and talk about when you're using a recipe, when you're writing a recipe, it's all in these command words or imperative tenses. It'd be also an interesting conversation to talk about metalinguistics, to use metalinguistics and talk about how using these command tones might be totally okay in this kind of discourse of writing a recipe, but totally not okay if you were to tell a person who is your friend, say you were talking with them and you said, and you were giving them commands, but not politely, right? So like the metalinguistics part of this could be, one example could be talking about how there's a polite imperative using please or using could you and things like that versus the command language, which is actually the written form of a recipe. And then of course, phonology, pronunciation of the words. If you're asking students to create a video with this recipe, they're going to have to pronounce some of the words in the video and be able to sound out some of the things that are a little harder for them to say. And so really, it's not so important to know every single aspect of language, but it's more important to think about that when you're looking at a final student product and what you want students to produce, it's not only about the vocabulary and not only about the grammar, but it's about lots of different aspects of language in it. And to think about it beyond just vocabulary and grammar. So what I'm not going to go into right now is teaching strategies, which is the third question that you'll be answering in your small groups, because I'm going into teaching strategies when we come back from the small groups. So right now, if Denzel, I don't know if there's some questions and answer period I can take. So we have any questions at this point before we kind of move into this small group activity?
If you have any questions about the exercise, you could feel free to ask Katie now before we move into small groups. We already have a question there, Katie, about using this with low-level ELLs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I would, so I teach very low English ELLs, and one way I might approach this recipe is first is chunking it, right? So like I would teach the discourse first, so understanding that there are different sections to a recipe. And then what I would do is I would totally chop off some things. So having recipes that are much shorter and having them be able to look at that first. I would also give them some sort of template. So I would give them lots of vocabulary word lists that are specifically cooking related, right? So ingredients, I would give them lots of different ingredients and say, here are different ingredients that you might use. And then lots of cooking verbs, like cooking commands, right? Steam, bake, shred, cut. These kinds of words I would put in a separate column. So for low English speaking ELLs, like having them sort of maybe even write in their native language first, a recipe that they like cooking at home or they are familiar with, and then have them be able to sort of circle like what are the big like words or command verbs that they want to know how to say, and then start from there. So I would totally use it like a native language support first for doing this with low English ELLs. Yes, and also I see in the comments that someone is saying use a video. So I would totally also, model it, show them the video of someone doing a cooking show, something really short. So like if you can get like a 2 or 3 minute video, especially for low English ELLs, that would be ideal so that they can see where they're headed, right? What they're being asked to do rather than trying to explain from the beginning.
All right, so I think we can get into our chat rooms now. And this one we've divided a little bit differently. It's the same chat rooms, but we will go for group 1 will be all those interested in a history project. Group 2 will be all those interested in ELA. Group 3 will be all those interested in math. And group 4 will be all those interested in science. So we're pasting the links directly into the chat box for all of you. And please try to get into the chat rooms that you'd like to be in. Don't use a space if you need to type in your temporary name. And if you are having tremendous problems, I think someone suggested you use Chrome. Chrome has been working well for most people in the chat rooms. If there's no way for you to get in the chat room, Katie will facilitate a chat right here in the webinar.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make sure that people, sorry, Denzel, I just wanted to make sure people could see the questions, and also, so the 2 big questions are the motivating activities, like what would you use to introduce students to this topic and give them sort of entry points for the core concepts, and sort of the benefits of having students do role playing to get into an experience, and then some people were talking about in different groups about how you can talk about in a more metalinguistic way. What would you say in a social situation versus a formal situation if you were writing a letter, for example? And I think the science and math groups were having a hard time. I'm not sure if there were that many people in them, but I think so. The idea is if you could if you were having students write or analyze a graph, like what kinds of things would you use to motivate students to get into a graph? And so some ideas of like maybe showing videos of a car accident and saying, is this really how it happened, or did it happen in a different way? So these are all sort of ideas to, when you look at a product, when you design a project for students, to not only write the task paper where it tells them the instructions of what to do, but to literally go through the process of designing and writing the project as you would have it, as if you were a student yourself. And then I think that process actually allows you to think about what are going to be the hard things for them in terms of language that are going to trip them up. So if they have, some people were talking about if there was a speaking part, then you could totally focus on phonology and how to pronounce certain words if you had to present it in a certain way on a video. So being able to look at what you expect students to produce, even if you create it yourself. So some of these projects, or most of these projects that I showed you, were created by teachers. And then how do you extract from that the kinds of language or the kinds of motivating activities that you could you could use to teach with, is sort of the general idea. So I'm going to move into some of the teaching strategies. Some of you had some really great ideas in the chat rooms, and then I'm going to see if we can, and Denzel, I'm going to remind you if there are like some burning questions during the session, then I would love for you to sort of just butt in and tell me that there's a burning question about the strategies that I'm going to show people. But these are strategies specifically that would help you teach about aspects of language. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my screen sharing and go back to my PowerPoint. So, oops, kind of click through this. Oops. Okay, so we looked at these example projects, and all these example projects will be available to you also online. And we're going to look at 4 different strategies in terms of teaching different aspects of language. And I think that you can see all that right now. Is that right? Sure. Sorry. Denzel, can everyone see this right now?
Yes, you can always look at the chat box to see the reaction from the attendees.
Sorry, I actually can't see it because my entire screen is filled up with this PowerPoint. Okay, so we're going to look at these 4 different things, and then Denzel, please, again, butt in and let me know if there are some questions around this. So the first thing we're going to look at is if you're teaching a project that is around a large body or a large chunk of text, how do you teach that, especially for low English language learners? And one of the ways to do that is to use model text and sentence frames. So we're going to look at some examples of that. Again, these are all available to you through this conference website, and you do not have to sort of like take notes or jot down things. You can actually look at it and kind of like just I'll walk through them with you. So you'll have copies of these things. Okay, so the first thing, the first thing that we're going to look at are scripts. So, okay. So if you were to tell a student to write a story around a letter, impersonating a person, for example, in the history group, they were looking at a mill girl. This is from a French Revolution perspective. So if you were a queen, how would you write it, right? So some thoughts on giving students some things to think about before they talk, before you actually have them write the discourse of a letter, or from a peasant's perspective, how would that look different? And then a lot of you had questions about, well, what do I do if there is a student that has very little English? And so I would say you scaffold, and it would look something like this. You'd have much more explicit frames around how you would write the actual journal entry or letter, and you would have sort of things that would help start their sentences or thought process. So this is the one around the queen. So not only do you have this part where there's sort of like there's a picture of the queen, and there's like a little gingerbread person that talks about, I think and I say this, and I do this, and I feel this, but you also have the sentence structures on the right here to help them. And you also might have down here, I have a word bank. So they don't just have to extract things from, what they want to say, but they might have some words down here that help them fill in the blanks. Again, from a peasant's perspective, this is the kind of scaffolding that I would do for an EL1 or ELD1 level student who's just new to English. Okay, so another example of scripts is looking at this. So this is really talking about discourse and in some ways metalinguistics, because when we're looking at this, we're able to sort of piece apart what an essay is. For many of our students, just giving them an outline that says, oh, you write an intro first and then 3 paragraphs and then a conclusion isn't enough. And so doing something like this, where you have, paragraph 1, you write, there's an introduction, and the parts of that introduction is an introduction and a thesis, right? So background, and then how many How many sentences would it be, and sentence starters of how you would start those 2 or 3 sentences. And then also to sort of zoom out and tell your students, what this part of the essay is going to introduce the topic of your essay, right? Your thesis is going to state the central argument of your essay, and it's one sentence only, and it starts like this. And so it gives them kind of a formula for students who are really low in English to begin to look at, begin to construct discourse beyond the sentence level. So I would do the same for paragraph 2, right? Paragraph 2, it's like, this is the topic sentence, and this is, you put an example, an analysis, and including sentence. This is a paragraph, right? But instead of just saying, write a paragraph, I really break it down here into like, how many sentences should each of these things be? How might they start if you're having trouble? So a lot of the times for students who, I'll have like mixed ability in a classroom in terms of English. And for some of the students, they really need this to start every single one of their sentences. And for other students who are maybe more skilled at the English language at this point, maybe 2s or 3s, they like looking at it because it gives them a sense that, oh, right, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, or I'm stuck right now. I can look at this example to help me. So I do that for paragraph 2, same for paragraph 3, and then again, the conclusion is the same kind of thing. You have a sense of like where the topics are and what the actual parts of the paragraph are going to be, as well as what their function is, how many sentences they are, and then some sentence starters to help them. For some students who can't write a 5-paragraph essay or 4-paragraph essay, you might want to do the same exact content with them, but in a paragraph form, right? So sticking that all into a paragraph instead of doing it in a really larger piece of discourse, but having the similar content. Okay, I'm going to look at another piece of a model text. So this is actually developed by a teacher at Charlestown High School. Her name is Anna Marks. And she was trying to get students to write a travel log or like a travel guide for visiting a country. They had just read a piece of literature that had a certain setting, and she wanted them to write a travelogue for that setting. And so what she did was go into like a Time article or New York Times article and take out really high power, high leverage sentences. For example, on this left here, visiting the Burj Khalifa, more than 160 stories soaring, 2,716.5 feet in the air, is like catching an airplane. So she deconstructed this sentence. This sentence she did not write. She actually took it from an actual piece of discourse that she wanted students to be able to produce at the end. And she deconstructed it and just into its various parts, the parts that hold the sentence together, and took out all the content. And then she rewrote it. Visiting Charlestown High School, a 6-story brick building filled with hundreds of gregarious and diverse students, is like traveling around the world. And then asking them to also write their own sentences. So at the sentence level, when you're asking students to produce something that is much more maybe or a bit higher than what they can produce by themselves, these are the kind of scaffolds that we would put in place. There are some other ones here. Again, these documents will be available to you. Will be available to you through this conference website. Okay, I'm going to look at another piece of writing frame that would help. So for some students, this is not enough, right? For some students, just having a line there is not enough. And that might be really hard for EL 1s and 2s. And so in that case, I would do something like this. So here is a section. So this is a piece of writing that I asked them produce to bring in five pictures representing home to them. And they had to not only describe the picture, but also to connect it to a certain text that we were reading, and also to make a connection to it, right? And we were also learning figurative language, so also to do some figurative language around it. And these were for my ESL 1 students. These were students that came in with no English, very little English, or just sort of conversational English. This was one of the first units that we did. So I provided them with this scaffold, so including the model text of what I wanted them to produce, right? So this column right here is what I actually want them to produce. For some students, they really latched onto this and looked at sort of like, how do I construct my sentence and insert the part that makes sense to me and the content that I want to include into this discourse piece of writing. On the left here in the middle column, I have not only sentence frames, but I also have some options of what you might write inside the lines, okay? So for students who are like, well, what am I supposed to write inside that line? This whole section is supposed to help them with that. So again, right? I even went as far as here as a simile to sort of like give them a sense of, okay, you have a thing, a person, or place here is like a something, a thing, a person, and place here. So the walls of my house are as yellow as egg yolks. Uses this one of these structures, uses this middle structure here. They were responsible for this project to do a Prezi presentation or PowerPoint, Google PowerPoint, and present their pictures and do an oral presentation of these, of their 5 pictures. So they did actually 5 of these for their final presentation. So I'm gonna now move back onto, sorry, excuse my moving around things. The second part is going to be word and sentence play, manipulatives. So how can you, sorry, let me just back up really quick. What I just showed you, the scripts and the model text and the sentence streams, that really has to do with discourse and syntax, like how do you place certain words in certain places. And then if you want to zoom out, it's metalinguistics, because if you're talking about discourse and you're talking about the different parts of a paragraph or the different parts of a presentation, then you're really talking about language and how you use language. The second one that I'm going to show you is around word and sentence play, manipulatives. When we know that a lot of you probably use this already, but lots of you probably use these kinds of manipulatives for students, as we all teach English language learners. But here is an example of what you might do for students. What I actually do is I do all these cut-ups of students, and we were reviewing past tense here in a certain unit that required students to write a lot of past tense in their final project. So what I did was I gave each student 2 of these words, and then I had them kind of go around the entire room and find each other to make sentences. And they really had to know like when to use the ed form of the word and when not to, right? So of course they need to know this when it's a positive sentence, they decided last night, or if they were changed this into negative, they did not decide last night. They would need to use sort of like, they understand the morphology of the word and understand that when you add ed to an ending of the word, it changes it into past tense. But in a negative way, when we're saying it in a negative sentence, you don't use the ed, you just use the not, did not, and then decide. So you could do this, you could give this to one student, you give lots of things to one student, or you could give this to lots of different students in the room and have them find each other. There's lots of different ways to sort of play around with this, to not only look at morphology, but this is of course syntax. How do you construct a sentence, right? And then as a scaffold for them, again, this is review. So as a scaffold for them, I would maybe write this on the board, just to help remind them that this is what a past tense sentence looks like. Like, what did you do last night?
Katie, we are running out of time. I think maybe you just take 1 or 2 more minutes if that's all right.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, let me just kind of go through. There's 2 more things that I want to show you that I'll just kind of briefly go through them. The third thing I was going to show you is about barrier graphs. So this is when you have one student on one side, you cannot see the other student what they're looking at, and you have a partner A describe what they see using these words and using these example sentences, and the other person is trying to draw this picture but they cannot see their partner. And so there are many examples of this. There's one for English. So partner A would see this picture and use these sentences and use this vocabulary to describe the picture, as partner B, who cannot see this picture, is trying to draw it. And then for chemistry example, here's a chemistry example. You're trying to get your partner to draw this. They can't see the picture, but you have some example words and example sentences to show them. Okay. The last thing I want to show you is around academic and social vocabulary. So as we know, students often are able to produce the kinds of things in social language and everyday language. They may be able to say farming, but they cannot say agriculture, things like that. And so this is to help them think about how to start translating everyday language into academic language. So giving them an everyday language and asking them with a word bank to translate this into academic language. And you can do all sorts of variations on this. One variation is to cut these up, right? So like this one is the same exact sentence as this one right here, but they are written in very different ways. This one is social language, and this one is academic language. And so if you cut these all up and ask them to match them, it'd be also a good way to sort of like ask them to think about, in a more meta way, what are some formal and informal ways to say things. Okay, so that basically concludes all the different teaching strategies that I was going to show. Denzel, I don't know if we have time for questions. If we don't, that's fine.
No, I think we're just about 2.5 minutes to go, so I think we'll probably want to wrap up. Katie did make it very clear to everyone that these things are available on the workshop website. We provided a lot of links. And what is great is that she's given us so many ideas, so many different ways of doing this. You're really making it easy for us, Katie, but thank you for that. I think that's why we asked you to be here. This was a great session, and I think we want to wrap up now. Thank you, Katie.
Sure.
Okay. All right.